So I am going to turn things over to our guest speaker today, Jennifer Perry, who is one of the most preeminent experts on accessibility, and in particular, accessibility to beaches in the country. And with that, Jennifer, take it away.
Thank you, Nancy. That was a big introduction, a lot to live up to. But thank you, everyone, for joining today for our presentation on beach access routes and key considerations for public entities. I'd like to thank the Mid-Atlantic ADA Center for inviting us to participate in today's webinar with them. So with that, Nancy, if you don't mind, we can move on to the next slide, which I believe is 12. And this is just my direct contact information. Should you have a question in the future, I would encourage you to reach out. My direct office phone number is provided here, which is 732-449-3621, as well as my email, which is J as in Jennifer, L as in Larry, P as in Peter, and then the numbers 359@cornell.edu. I am with the Northeast ADA Center, which is housed at Cornell University. That's why my email has a cornell.edu extension. So just as Nancy mentioned, the Northeast ADA Center is also part of the ADA National Network, and we love to have opportunities to work together, especially because both the Mid-Atlantic ADA Center and the Northeast ADA Center have a lot of beaches. So it's great when we can partner on topics such as this. So should you need to reach out in the future, there's my contact information. Nancy, we can go on to the next slide. I am obligated to share this disclaimer. If you've joined any of our webinars in the past, you're probably familiar with this, but we are obligated to let you know that we are authorized by NIDLR, who Nancy mentioned a minute ago, to provide information, materials, technical assistance, and trainings on topics related to the ADA, but I am not an attorney. So the information provided today should not be construed as legal advice. Next slide, Nancy. And I apologize, Nancy, I can't see the slide number right now at the bottom of the screen. So I hope that's not throwing anybody off. Okay, the next slide is just showing the 1-800 number again that you can use to contact your regional ADA center. And that is 1-800-949-4232. I know we have people attending today, probably from all over the country, but if you call that number, you will be connected directly with your regional ADA center based on your area code. So please do feel free to reach out to your ADA center, whether it's a question about today's topic or something else related to the ADA. We are here to help and would love to take your calls. Okay, so this is our kind of loose agenda for today. We intend on reviewing the following. The beginning part of the presentation, I should say, we're going to focus on how Title II of the ADA and the obligations for program accessibility apply to public beaches. And then in the second half of the presentation, we're going to focus specifically on the Architectural Barriers Act and the Outdoor Developed Areas Final Rule, and specifically within that rule, the scoping and technical requirements for beach access routes. So that really is the game plan for the next hour. And we can go on to the next slide. So, as I said, we're going to talk about how does Title II of the ADA apply to public beaches. So I'm sure as many of you are aware, Title II of the ADA covers all programs, activities, and services that are offered by public entities. And Title II, the goal, if you will, is to protect individuals with disabilities from discrimination on the basis of their disability in receiving the services, programs, or activities of all state and local governments. So that's kind of the big overarching message, if you will, of Title II. We want to be thinking about non-discrimination in not just beaches, but all of our program services and activities that are offered by that public entity. And a public entity is defined as any state or local government or any department, agency, special purpose district, or instrumentality of state or local government. So that certainly would include a city or a town that operates a public beach. If your beach has a specific beach department, Title II of the ADA would apply to that department as well. We can go on to the next slide. So we talked about program accessibility. And just to reiterate, we want to be thinking about the programs, services, and activities that are offered. When you look at them in their entirety, are they accessible to and usable by people with disabilities? More importantly, remember that public entities cannot deny the benefits of the programs, services, and activities that they offer to people with disabilities. So that's kind of this overarching notion, if you will, of program accessibility and trying to make sure that individuals with disabilities have equal access. And we can go to the next slide, please, Nancy. So in this slide here, you'll see on the right, there's a photograph of a ramp leading over a dune to gain access to a tidal beach. And in the upper left-hand corner, there's an image of a light bulb. My intention here was if you want to think of this as a light bulb moment, I think so often when we think about physical accessibility, it's really easy to think of accessible parking and accessible toilet rooms and office buildings and city hall and access to voting and schools and libraries. Beaches would be included in that thought process, but I think for some reason, because it's a little bit more out of the box and recreation hasn't received the recognition that some of those other areas I just mentioned, because it hasn't received as much recognition, sometimes beaches get lost in the mix, if you will. They might be at the bottom of what some people are thinking of and when they're thinking about improving accessibility. So just give me 1 second. I'm not seeing the captions, but sorry about that, everybody. Just trying to turn off the chat here. So back to my light bulb moment. Sorry, I got distracted there. So we want to be thinking about, again, about beaches as something that accessibility needs to be taken into consideration. In addition to that, instead of when we think about program accessibility, so if you're a public entity and you're thinking about accessibility, so many times we start with, well, let's go out to the building or let's go out to the parking lot with our tape measure and see where we're wrong. I'm not saying that's a bad idea, but I'm saying a better starting point would be to look at what activities are being offered within that state or local government building or within that borough hall, and how are the activities taking place inside that building? How are they accessible or not to people with disabilities? And take that as your starting point. There may be things that you can manipulate or move around to make sure that the clerk on the second office, that their services can be provided on the first floor, perhaps. If you start from that position, you then figure out, okay, there are certain barriers that we can't relocate and we have to investigate physical accessibility changes or alterations in order to make something accessible. So my point is, we want to be thinking about what is the service that we are offering to the public, and is it or is it not accessible? That's the light bulb moment. And we can go to the next slide, Nancy. And this notion of program accessibility for many of you, and I apologize if you've all heard this before, but it's not a new concept, right? It's been around since the ADA was signed, what are we coming up on 33 years ago. So it's not a new concept. It just might be new to some in thinking about beaches. So where else do we see program accessibility often come up? Well, specific to recreation, when the ADA standards were updated, we all know that we now had requirements related to recreation for things like swimming pools. So in the upper left-hand corner of the slide here, there's a photograph of a young woman using a pool lift to gain access into a swimming pool. In the bottom left-hand corner, there's a photograph of a play area, some accessible play equipment. And then on the right, there's a picture of some students at picnic tables, what appears to be a counselor and doing some crafts. Likely, this appears to be some kind of summer camp program. So that notion of program accessibility that I just talked about, and ensuring that these specific programs or activities are accessible to people with disabilities, it's the same concept that we're talking about when we think about beaches. We can go on to the next slide, Nancy. Now, there are some limitations when we talk about program accessibility in general. And they include that a public entity doesn't have to take any actions that would fundamentally alter the nature of the program or activity, or those steps that would cause undue financial or administrative burdens on the public entity. But it's important to remember that that public entity, even if they determine perhaps that something is an undue burden, they have a responsibility to look for alternative ways to ensure that people with disabilities have access to the benefits and services of the program that's provided. So that was my roundabout way to kind of get us to this slide here. So hopefully we can all agree that Title II of the ADA would apply to public beaches. If we can all agree on that point, then we can agree that program accessibility is going to apply to beaches as a program, service, or activity of a public entity. And we know that we can't deny people with disabilities the benefits of that activity, in this case, or that service, which is access to beaches. So Title II of the ADA would apply. So the next step, if you happen to be that public entity, is that you want to be thinking about, how can we provide for access for people with disabilities? And today we're focusing on beach access routes. So you might want to consider, should we be thinking about permanent solutions for beach access routes, or would removable beach access routes work better? Different types of coastal shorelines have different needs, different requirements, and different restrictions, frankly, that are in place. So you'd want to think about, how can we do this? If you haven't already, what should we be considering? And then you have to go in and do the research, right? Which always comes up when we think about program accessibility. For those of you that have been involved in doing self-evaluation and transition plans, the next step usually is to find out, okay, it looks like we're going to have to spend some money. We're going to have to do some alterations to provide for accessibility. So you determine what those costs are. Hopefully, you can afford them, and then you can install and maintain these beach access routes. If that's not possible immediately, then you kind of follow the same line of logic that you perhaps do for other areas of your transition plan, which is you identify what the cost would be to improve for access over a, try to come up with a defined period of time that you would need to obtain that funding, and then coordinate that with your ADA transition plan to try to provide for improving accessibility. So you can kind of think of beaches as just becoming the next piece of the pie in your transition plan if you have not already provided for beach access routes. We can go on to the next slide, Nancy. Okay. So if we can all agree that Title II of the ADA applies and we're thinking about program accessibility, the next question is, well, what standards should I use? Where's the book? What book am I looking at to find out how do I do this and how do I do this in the right way? So the next, we're going to go through a bunch of slides about the outdoor developed areas rule to try to help us grapple with that question. So we can go on to the next slide. So when we think about the ADA and specifically the 2010 ADA standards for accessible design, when the update became mandatory in March of 2012, we had this whole new chapter that addressed recreational facilities, specifically the technical requirements for recreational facilities. And in there, and even in the scoping of the ADA standards, we now saw requirements for things like swimming pools. So in the upper left-hand corner of the screen, there's an image of a swimming pool lift, which is often used to provide for access into the water of swimming pools. We also now have scoping and technical requirements for golf courses, where there's an image of a golf course to the right of the swimming pool lift photo. We also have requirements for things like fishing piers. There's an image of a fishing pier in the bottom left corner of the screen. And then to the right, again, there's an image of a play area with some playground equipment. So prior to March of 2012, we didn't have this kind of specific scoping and technical requirements for recreational facilities like we now do. And we can go on to the next slide, Nancy. And this is just a list of the complete recreation facilities that are now scoped in the 2010 ADA standards for design. So we have amusement rides and boating facilities, exercise machines, mini golf, saunas, shooting facilities. So all kinds of things of recreation were addressed. And we can go on to the next slide. But no beaches, right? nothing in the 2010 standard says beach access routes. So we can all agree that the standards for design don't specifically address beach access routes. That doesn't negate the program accessibility obligations that we discussed. So people with disabilities, remember, just keep reminding yourself, people with disabilities have a right to benefit from public beaches just as others do. But when we think about program accessibility, we also know that the Department of Justice has made it clear that public entities are allowed to have some flexibility when they determine how they're going to achieve program accessibility. So there is no bright line rule for how to achieve program access. Some flexibility is permitted. So in the case of beach access routes, again, some flexibility is permitted. But one of the things a public entity must give priority to is those methods that provide for the integration of people with disabilities. So you want to be thinking about, how is this going to be most beneficial for people with disabilities? Certainly, if you can, you'd want to get input from your local disability community on how program accessibility can be the most inclusive of individuals with disabilities. And the key really is to make a good faith effort to provide access. Even if, as I said, those ADA standards for design don't say exactly, here's your roadmap to achieve beach access routes that check the box for ADA compliance, that doesn't mean you don't have to make an attempt to provide for accessibility. And I just saw the comment from somebody, and we are so about to get there about the ABA. Next slide, please, Nancy. Like right now, to whoever just sent that comment in the chat. So because the ADA standards don't contain that roadmap, I'll just call it that, where can we go? What can we look at? What I think is considered a best practice would be the Outdoor Developed Areas Final Rule, which was issued under the Architectural Barriers Act, or the AB as in boy, A, not to be confused with the ADA, but under the Architectural Barriers Act, back in November, I believe, of 2013, this Outdoor Developed Areas Final Rule was issued. And what was awesome about this rule is that it addressed lots of recreation facilities that, again, aren't mentioned in the ADA standards for design. Things like hiking trails, picnic and camping facilities, and yay, beach access routes, as well as viewing areas. So there's some images on the slide highlighting some of those areas that are addressed in the final rule. In the top left, there's an image of a beach access mat at a beach over sand. In the bottom left, there's an image of a camper as well as 2 campers with disabilities at a campsite about to pitch a tent. Then on the right, there's another campsite with an accessible picnic table and some campers gathered around the table. So let's talk a little bit more about the Architectural Barriers Act and this rule specifically. We can go to the next slide, Nancy. So start by, for those of you that aren't familiar with the Architectural Barriers Act, this law has been around forever, specifically since 1968, and it really marks one of the first efforts to provide for physical accessibility to the built environment. It specifically applies to facilities that are designed, built, altered, or leased with federal funds. That's very important. That's the distinction between the ABA and the ADA, is the tie to federal funding. So again, it's been around since 1968. The United States Access Board, who we all love, develops and maintains the accessibility guidelines under the ABA. And if people are concerned about a facility, again, a federally funded facility or a facility that received federal funds and there's an accessibility issue, the mechanism to enforce your rights there would be to file a complaint with the United States Access Board. We can go on to the next slide. So when the Access Board released this outdoor developed areas final rule, they kind of the press release, if you will, I think says a lot, particularly about why we're referencing using this final rule as a best practice document in order to achieve program accessibility to beaches. Because the Access Board acknowledged, it's been a challenge to achieve access in outdoor environments. And that's because of a few things, including the constraints posed by terrain, development, construction practices, materials, and other factors. And the Access Board, again, these outdoor developed areas requirements for recreational sites specifically apply to areas like national parks. And they have issued some guides, that explain these requirements. We can go on to the next slide. So specifically, this rule addresses, as I said earlier, trails, picnic facilities, beach access routes, and these standards right now, while they're mandatory for entities covered under the Architectural Barriers Act, they are not mandatory under the Americans with Disabilities Act. The hope is that sometime in the future that will be the case, but for now, to be clear, the outdoor developed areas rule and the scoping and technical requirements that we're talking about are mandatory, again, for federal sites, federal facilities, and those built or altered with federal funds. And we can go to the next slide. So just to make that a little clearer, who is covered under the ADA? That would include facilities or sites constructed or altered by federal agencies. So again, think of things like national parks. As well as non-federal entities that are constructing facilities on federal land on behalf of a federal agency. What is not covered under the Architectural Barriers Act are facilities that are subject to the ADA or ABA facilities that are built or altered with federal grants or loans. So the point here is that federal grants or loans do not necessarily trigger a requirement to have to comply with the outdoor developed areas final rule. So that then begs the $1 million question. If the ADA standards don't address beach access routes, where should I go? I think I've kind of already led the witness here. I would say your best practice gold star, call it what you want, would be the outdoor developed areas final rule and beach access routes. And I also say this because don't forget that under the ADA, where no standards exist, you still have that general non-discrimination as well as program accessibility requirements. So even if you open the 2010 ADA standards and you don't see a direct roadmap or a direct call out for beach access routes, you still have program accessibility to consider. And how are we going to allow people with disabilities to benefit from that program, which is a beach? So again, going back to our disclaimer at the very beginning, I would be remiss if I didn't say, if you want to double check, Jen, I don't know that I'm going to take your word for it. You can always call the Department of Justice and ask them, what's your take on, should I be using the outdoor developed areas rule as a best practice guide for achieving access to public beaches? And for what it's worth, many, many, many beach communities are doing just that. So, but you can always call DOJ. Their phone number is here, their technical assistance line, if you wanted to ask that question. And we can go to the next slide, Nancy. So let's dive in. Let's take a look at the specific. We're not going to look. We don't have time today to address the entire outdoor developed areas final rule. We are only focusing in on beach access routes. But if you are interested in those other things that I mentioned, like camping and picnic facilities, then you certainly can look at. There is certainly much more to the rule than just beach access routes. So in terms of beach access routes, under the outdoor developed areas rule, so if you had a site like a national park, for instance, that had a beach, whenever there is a construction or alteration of facilities such as circulation paths, that could be something like a paved trail, perhaps a boardwalk, parking facilities, toilet facilities, or bathing facilities, then the requirement to provide beach access routes would be triggered. There is an exception that limits the cost of the beach access route to being no more than 20% of the cost of constructing or altering those facilities, the circulation paths, parking, toilet, or bathing facilities. In addition to that, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that when an entity engages in a beach nourishment program, so when you're replenishing the beach, there is a requirement then that triggers providing a beach access route as well, with the same exception that you don't have to spend more than 20% of the cost of the beach nourishment project to providing for that beach access route. And again, remember, these are mandatory under the ABA. We're thinking best practice for program accessibility, keeping in mind that public entities do have some flexibility in achieving program access. Next slide, Nancy, please. So the Access Board, was very wise, and they recognized when they issued the Outdoor Developed Areas final rule that there's going to have to be exceptions to the rule. We're in the outdoors. We're talking about hiking trails and campsites and beaches. So there are what are known as conditional exceptions that are looked at, on a case by case or provision by provision basis. And generally the notion is that if you can't fully comply with the technical provision, that you would comply with the technical requirements to the maximum extent practicable. When we think about beaches, because of the nature of different types of beaches, there's often a lot of restrictions that might come up. Not to mention just wave action and how that can impact a beach. Other types of federal laws, whether it's a Wilderness Protection Act or Endangered Species Acts. I happen to live in an area where there is piping plovers that happen to like to nest on the beach where I live. And it's a federally protected area because of that. They're an endangered species. So many times laws like that will limit how much you can do and how much you can interrupt those areas. So because of laws and regulations like that, as well as combined with just the nature of the environment, there are some what are rather logical exceptions. However, there's no blanket exception. You still are expected to comply to the maximum extent practicable. And I should mention, under the ABA, the Architectural Barriers Act, if a beach says that, there are just so many conditions, there's nothing we can do, at that point in time, they would appeal to the United States Access Board and let them know what their conditions are that are so severe that they can't do anything to achieve beach access. Next slide, please, Nancy. So when we look at the technical requirements for beach access routes, beach access routes, not rats. One of the biggest things to point out is that they are permitted to be either permanent or removable. And this is important again, because particularly depending on the type of beach, some beaches and depending where you are in the country, people aren't really using them as much, perhaps in the winter as they are in the summer. It might not be safe to use them at certain times of the year. So for a number of those reasons, removable beach access routes are permitted. They can also be permanent if someone chooses to do so. Under the ABA, if you're thinking about, well, how many beach access routes do I need? The ABA requires at least one route for each half mile of shoreline that is managed by the entity that controls the beach. However, you're not required to exceed the number of pedestrian access points to a beach that is provided by the entity. And on the right side, there is an image here of a removable beach access mat. I'm sure many of you have seen them. They've become increasingly popular over the past 5-6 years. And they can be put out and moved as needed. And then in certain areas of the country, they can be stored for the winter. Next slide, please. In terms of the location of these beach access routes, Well, you want them to coincide with or be located in the same area as other pedestrian access points to the beach. Very similar to what I'm sure you're all familiar with under the 2010 ADA standards. We never want the accessible route for someone with a disability to be circuitous or much longer and around the back when people without disabilities have a straight shot to gain access to a site. Same logic applies here. And those pedestrian access points generally, everything is going to be site specific, but generally speaking, if there are parking facilities, then you'd want to ensure a beach access route is proximate to parking, specifically to accessible parking, as well as dune crossings and ramps leading from boardwalks, if they're provided, to the beach. And there's a photograph here on the left side of the screen of a traditional boardwalk. To the right of the boardwalk, there is on-street angled parking that is provided. And then there are ramps that would get you from the parking area onto the boardwalk. And then at certain blocks, there is ramped access down to the sand on the left-hand side of the boardwalk that then connects to removable beach access mats. And we can go on to the next slide. So the question then becomes, okay, if I get down to the sand, I have a ramp, I have a beach access route, how far does that route have to go to the shoreline? So the outdoor developed areas rule has some requirements here depending on the type of beach. So the access route should connect an entry point of the beach to the high tide level at tidal beaches, to the mean high water level at river beaches, or to the normal recreation water level at things like lakes, ponds, and reservoir beaches. The surface, the ground surface of a beach access route should be firm and stable. Notice we don't have the slip resistant that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but it should be firm and stable. And the minimum clear width is 60 inches minimum for a beach access route. Obstacles where they pop up along a beach access route are permitted to be up to 1 inch maximum in height, unless that surface is essentially man-made. If it's something that's concrete, asphalt, or something like boards on a boardwalk, then your obstacles are only permitted to be up to a 1/2 inch high maximum along that beach access route. And this is a nod again to remember the outdoor developed areas rule addresses things like hiking trails. And when you're in that type of trail environment, there are going to be things in nature that you can't move sometimes, like whether it's tree roots or rocks or things of that nature, those kinds of obstacles. So they are addressed how high they can be if they're interrupting an access route. Next slide, please. So just to illustrate that point a little further, here on this slide, there are 2 photographs. On the left, this is a photograph from AmericanTrails.org. And this is a photo looking down a crushed rock trail toward the river from a picnic area at the BLM recreation area along the Colorado River east of Moab, Utah. And then on the right, you'll see a photograph that shows the transition from the crushed rock trail to the plastic mats that are used to continue that beach access route to get you to the edge of the shoreline there. So I just wanted to include this picture, and thank you to American Trails, because I wanted to make it clear this isn't just something that applies to ocean or to tidal beaches. Next slide, please. So what is the slope? Whenever we talk about accessible routes, of course, we're thinking about what's the maximum slope I can use. So the running slope of a segment of a beach access route shall not be steeper than 1 to 10. And then where the running slope of a segment of a beach access route is steeper than 1 to 20, steeper than 1 to 20, the maximum length of the segment shall comply with the table below, and a resting interval has to be provided. And there is a table here from the outdoor developed areas rule showing you the running slope. So for instance, if you have a slope between 1 to 20, but not steeper than 1 to 12, your beach access route can go up to 50 feet, no more than 50 feet, before you provide what's known as a resting interval. And a resting interval is an area for somebody with a disability to basically catch their breath, similar to a landing on a traditional ramp, so that you have time to take a break before you continue on along that access route. If you have a beach access route with the slope between 1 to 12, not steeper than 1 to 10, then you can go up to 30 feet before providing a resting interval. Again, a safe place where you can stop, rest, catch your breath before continuing along on that beach access route. Next slide. Cross slope is also addressed for beach access routes, and depending on the ground surface material, that dictates what your maximum cross slope can be. So if it's something like concrete, asphalt, or a boardwalk, your maximum cross slope is 2%, which is what you're accustomed to with most ramps. And if it's an other surface, more of a natural surface, then your cross slope cannot be steeper than 1 to 20 or 5%. And those resting intervals that I mentioned previously that you might need, depending on the slope of your beach access route, are required to be sized at 60 inches by 60 inches minimum. And these are, again, level areas where you can rest. It's important for me to point out that if you are using removable beach access mats, like the blue mats that were highlighted earlier, then these running slope requirements and the requirement for resting intervals do not apply. So these requirements apply only to the permanent beach access routes where they are constructed. Next slide. Elevated dune crossings. And certain areas of the country, have much larger dunes than other areas. So these can be very plentiful in some areas and not too common in other areas, but in either case, they are addressed. The technical requirements are addressed for elevated dune crossings. And when they are provided, handrails and edge protection have to be provided. And there are 2 exceptions for these elevated dune crossings that permit them to be reduced to 48 inches minimum, for the dune crossing, as opposed to 60 inches minimum, which is typically the requirement for beach access routes. And the dune crossings are not required to comply with the requirements for resting intervals. And if we go to the next slide, see a line drawing of an elevated dune crossing. So it's going to look a lot to you, other than the 48 inches minimum clearance, you still, for what you're used to for ramps. So we have our edge protection, we have our handrails, and this is something that can provide a permanent beach access route to the shoreline. We can go to the next slide, please. I wanted to take a moment to mention what is shown in the photograph here, which is just one example of the many types of beach wheelchairs that are available on the market today. This is just an example, but the ADA standards never say that you have to provide a beach wheelchair. I will say that this is something that certainly a public entity could purchase and use as part of their program accessibility plan to improve access to beaches. But I cannot say that you absolutely have to have them. It's just wouldn't be a true factual statement. But having said that, they are of great benefit to many people with disabilities, not to everybody. And one of the reasons for that is these beach wheelchairs obviously have the larger wheels, but they cannot be used independently. So you would need assistance in order to use a beach wheelchair such as this. For some people, they are great, and they are a great way to enjoy a day at the beach. But without having a beach access route for those people that cannot transfer to, or perhaps for whatever reason cannot use a beach wheelchair or choose not to use a beach wheelchair, we still want to be thinking of how do we provide that beach access route so that somebody could perhaps use their mobility device of choice in order to go over the sand. And that gets us back to the beach access routes that we were just talking about. So beach wheelchairs, they're great. Some towns have beach wheelchairs that can actually be taken out into the water and used for recreation. There's so many different kinds. I would just say that, just having a beach wheelchair is not going to, in my humble opinion, meet your obligations for program accessibility at the beach if you don't also have some kind of beach access route available. Next slide. And when we think about beaches, don't forget about a lot of the other things that are common to public beaches. And these are areas where there's no guesswork. We know that the 2010 ADA standards for accessible design apply to parking, right? We know the ADA standards apply to toilet rooms, bathing rooms, rinsing showers, drinking fountains, pavilions, dining areas. So if you have picnic tables, we know that at least 5% or at least one of those have to be accessible. And we know that we can go to the 2010 standards to look for what are those standards. If I'm going to build an accessible picnic table, what requirements do I have to meet? If I'm putting in a unisex bathroom and I want to make it accessible, we know you can go to the ADA standards for design to find out how to do that. So just as a friendly reminder, don't forget about those other features that are common at beaches. Next slide. Oh, and I just put in a few things here about parking. In the interest of time, I'm not sure that we're going to go through all of them, but remember, in terms of parking, if you have a lot, you want to make sure that you have, well, first and foremost, the correct number of accessible parking spaces based on how many total spaces are in the lot. You want to make sure that at least 1 out of every 6 is van accessible, and you have your options for how to achieve van accessibility with the 8-foot wide space, an 8-foot wide aisle, or the 11-foot wide space with a smaller access aisle. The accessible spaces, of course, need signage with a symbol of accessibility. And depending on where you are, there's very likely additional state requirements for signage at accessible parking spaces. Perhaps for the penalty that you will be charged if you're ticketed for illegally parking there, or additional signage requirements for the access aisle. Every state seems to have their own quirky thing there. So just be mindful of that. And we can go to the next slide, Nancy. Oh, and here's, I forgot I had this in here. Just a figure showing you the ADA requirements for accessible parking, the width of the parking space, as well as the adjacent access aisle on the top left corner. Showing you for a traditional car accessible space, and then on the top right, showing a traditional van accessible space with a minimum 8-foot wide access aisle. And then on the bottom drawing, on the left side is the traditional van accessible option, and on the right is showing the larger 11-foot wide parking space with an adjacent minimum 5-foot wide access aisle. Either of those two options works for achieving van accessibility. Many people with disabilities have advocated, when possible, to use the 11-foot wide parking space design because it discourages people from trying to cram their car into the 5-foot wide access aisle. For those people that mistakenly think the van accessible access aisle that is 8 feet wide can be used as a parking space. And many of you, I'm sure, are aware that's traditionally been a challenge for people with disabilities using van parking. So, but either one works. Either option works under the ADA. And I think I quickly saw a question pop up about on-street parking. That's an excellent question. I would point you to the public rights-of-way accessibility guidelines because they have scoping and technical requirements that specifically address on-street parking as well. So if you're looking for guidance on accessibility related to on-street parking, I would point you to PROAG. And if you have questions about that, you can certainly contact your ADA center. Next slide, Nancy. So just like when we think about, well, where do I put the accessible parking spaces? If you have an office building or a restaurant or a shopping mall, in this case, you want to put them on the shortest accessible route of travel to the beach access routes that are served by that parking area. So you don't want someone to have a circuitous route to get from the accessible parking if the ramp is a block to the left of where your accessible parking is, and you want to locate your accessible parking proximate to that beach access route and disperse them if you have multiple beach access routes. And there's an image here showing you a parking lot in front of a shoreline community with accessible parking and toilet rooms. Next slide, please. Location of accessible parking. I was telling Nancy before we started today's webinar, my family and I took a trip to Fort Lauderdale last Easter, and it was the most god-awful weather. We actually drove home to New Jersey because all the airports shut down in Fort Lauderdale. But it gave me an opportunity to wander around and get some photographs. So on the left-hand side here, you can see there's an on-street reserved accessible parking space. And then the image on the right is directly to the right of that white car that is shown parked in the accessible parking space. So we have a reserved on-street parking space with a curb cut, the ability to get right up to, in this case, the paved beginning of a beach access route. And if you continue down that path, you would reach a removable beach access mat that got you to the high tide level watermark on the beach. Next slide. Toilet facilities, as a reminder, in the interest of time, we can't go through all the requirements for toilet facilities, but if you provide them, you have to have accessible toilet facilities. Next slide. If you offer things like vendors or concession stands, think about how will people with disabilities access them? Meaning, are they on an accessible route? Is there clear floor space in front of the area where people might get their fountain sodas or their ketchup packets or things of that nature? Are those elements within accessible reach ranges? And has staff been trained how to offer assistance to people with disabilities and accessing these different elements? And there's just some photographs here of a popcorn machine where somebody could offer assistance. Same thing with a typical concession counter. And on the far right, a lowered accessible counter for people with disabilities. Next slide, please. And events. Many times beaches turn into event areas, whether it's summer concert series or annual fairs or markets that might pop up. There's an image here of a pavilion adjacent to a boardwalk and beachfront area where they do just that. Set up summer concerts, and they would set up removable chairs in front of this area for concerts. So whenever you offer events like that as a public entity, you want to make sure that you are thinking through the accessibility of that event. Even if you're using folding chairs, have you thought about leaving space for somebody who's using a wheelchair mobility device or somebody perhaps using a cane? Have you trained your staff on how to provide assistance if that's provided there? So just don't forget about event planning. That is often common to these types of areas. Next slide. And I know that so many coastal communities have done a great job improving accessibility. So I would encourage you to promote those accessibility features. And on the left, there's just an image of the front cover of Accessible Beach Guide for a county in New Jersey. I know there are so many states and so many counties that have done something similar. I would encourage you to do this because people with disabilities certainly want to be able to participate in recreation and want to go to the beach. But many times people are accustomed to not having accessible accommodations. So if you have accessibility features, I would encourage you to promote them. Use your website. Look into the possibility of a guide such as this one. And then think about from people arriving at the beach to whatever activities they might partake in. And are there pitfalls to accessibility? Things like parking, the accessible routes to the beach. Do you have beach wheelchairs? I'm not saying you have to, but if you do, how do people get them? And information about accessible toilet rooms, bathing rooms. If you're planning events, you want to think about accessibility. You also want people to know, what are your hours of operation? What does it cost? And who do I call if I have questions about the beach access routes or about the availability of accessible toilet rooms? So provide that information, both phone and email if possible, so that people can get those questions addressed. And finally, staff training. We can't say enough about training your staff on providing assistance for people with disabilities, whether that's disability etiquette, as well as physical accessibility concerns. training your staff on how to be welcoming and accommodating for visitors with disabilities goes a long way in people having a good experience or, a great day at the beach. And we can go to the next slide, Nancy. Questions. Perfect. We did get through it. So thank you, everybody. I think it looks like there's been some questions, so I'm happy to kind of entertain those now if you'd like, Nancy.
Yeah, we do have a couple questions, and just by way of reminder, folks, if you have questions, please use the Q&A feature there to put them. One question that we have is, are sand surfaces permitted for ADA parking areas? And if so, how do you mark them?
I would say no. Under the ADA for parking areas, your ground surface requirement under the ADA standards is stable, firm, and slip resistant. And sand is not going to meet that performance standard. So I would say if I would just kind of leave it at that. No, sand would not be an accessible ground surface for a parking area.
Now, we do have a couple other questions that sort of hark back to talking about the distinctions and the coverage between the Barriers Act and the Disabilities Act. So maybe you could just recap that a little bit for folks. We have a couple questions about, does the Barriers Act apply to municipal beaches or county beaches? So
perfect. So municipal or county beaches, no. And the only exception to that would be you kind of sometimes have to trace the money. But for the most part, the Architectural Barriers Act applies to those sites that are owned by the federal government, leased by the federal government, or altered by. And I'm just trying to pull up that slide real quick. It does not apply to, if you're just receiving a federal grant or loan as a public beach, meaning not a federal beach, then the outdoor developed areas rule is not triggered. We are really sharing all this information about the ABA because we're using it as a best practice guide to achieve beach access routes in public beaches. But to be clear, the Architectural Barriers Act applies to those beaches constructed or altered by a federal agency or non-federal entities that construct facilities on federal land on behalf of federal agencies. So if it's just a beach, if it's just a coastal community and they are not on federal property, then the ADA would certainly apply, as would program accessibility obligations. But I cannot say that you are mandated to comply with the outdoor developed areas rule, but I do think that would be your best practice guide for beach access.
now we do have a couple of questions here, which I'm not sure you want to address or really have time to address. Some folks may want to follow up with their regional centers, but we have a couple questions about service animals access to beaches. Are there any issues around that particular issue that you're aware of?
So just as with other areas where Title II of the ADA applies, service animals generally are permitted to go wherever members of the public are permitted to go. Now, in terms of beaches, one caveat I could possibly see, as I mentioned earlier, that Endangered Species Act. So if there is an Endangered Species Act, like the piping plover that I have here in my backyard, if dogs, if that Endangered Species Act precludes dogs being in a certain area, then there might perhaps be a rule that would include service dogs. But generally speaking, I would think, and tell me if you disagree, Nancy, service dogs would be permitted to accompany their owners on the beach. Where it gets tricky is service dogs actually swimming in the ocean or in the lake or in the pond along with their owner. That I've had that question before, and that frankly requires, according to DOJ, an individualized assessment, because ultimately, if the service dog isn't performing a task to assist someone with a disability, the service dog isn't permitted to swim just for their benefit. The right to swim would be in order to provide assistance in the water for the individual with disability. So that requires service dogs in the ocean is a different story. But generally, I would think they're permitted to go where wherever other beachgoers are permitted to go. But it has to be under control of their handler as well.
Well, thank you. I mean, that feels like almost a bonus information after all the great information that you shared with us. I just do want to kind of jump through these last couple of slides that we have, and especially make sure that we give people our the code that we promised to give them. Again, we have Jennifer shared some great resources here, and you all have this information in your handouts, the U.S. Access Board and their information about the outdoor developed areas standards, as well as the ADA checklist at adachecklist.org, which can be used for other types of facilities, toilet rooms, and so forth. Again, some great resources here from the National Forest Service, the U.S. Department of Justice, which is at ada.gov. The Northeast ADA Center, we want to thank Jennifer so much for sharing this wealth of information that she shared with us. We want to thank everyone for joining us today. This has been a terrific session. Our next webinar coming up in August is on protecting the rights of disabled parents involved in the child welfare system. We also want to remind folks that today is the final day for registration for our ADA, what we're calling our mini-con, our one-day conference on employment for people with disabilities. So check our website at ADA Info for information on that. And with that, I'll just see if Jennifer has any perhaps parting words for us.
I just want to say thank you so much, Nancy. I love working with the Mid-Atlantic ADA Center. It was great to be here. You guys had some great questions, and I would encourage you to reach out either to myself or to your local ADA center if you have any questions in the future. And thank you again.
Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.